Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So my name is Dr. Tiara Caldwell. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Graduate Educational Equity Programs in the Graduate School, and I am here to introduce Dr. Miller. Casey W. Miller is an Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs and Professor in the College of Science at the Rochester Institute of Technology, also known as RIT. Dr. Miller is an experimental physicist whose research focuses on nanoscale magnetic materials and related devices. He has secured nearly $3 million in federally funded grants, published 48 peer-reviewed articles, and given more than 125 conference presentations and invited talks. Dr. Miller earned his bachelor's degree in physics at Wittenberg University and his PhD in physics from the University of Texas at Austin. He completed his postdoctoral work at the University of California, San Diego, and is a recipient of the NSF Career and AFOSR Young Investigator Awards. He served as director of the RIT's Material Science and Engineering Program and associate director for the University of South Florida's Applied Physics PhD program. Dr. Miller has been recognized for his work on exploring methods for transforming recruitment, admissions, and retention to increase the access and inclusion in STEM fields for underrepresented groups. He works with the Professional Society of Physics, the American Physical Society, also known as APS. In this capacity, he was appointed by the APS president to its Committee on Minorities, served as chair of the 2017 APS Graduate and Bridge Program Conference, and has been invited to speak at multiple APS department chairs conferences. Without further ado, everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Casey Miller.
Okay. Hi. I have to switch computers. Thank you for the introduction. I haven't heard one like that before. It was pretty cool. Usually I provide one that's like, it's a thing you're supposed to put up, and then sometimes people read it. But you did this on your own. That was cool. So it's a pleasure to be here. And let me F5 that thing and get this here. So I haven't been to Penn State before. So I'm happy to be here. I drove down yesterday, and one of the hazards of driving is I forgot to bring my jacket out of the closet. So sorry about that. So I'm here to tell you about a holistic review. This is something I've been working on for the better part of a decade at this point, and it's something that has been embraced by the community. So we've given, so my partner Julie Passelt and I, she's an educational sociologist at the University of Southern Cal, we go out to programs and graduate schools and do these kinds of workshops for the past several years. So here's an example of what we do. On the left-hand side is our NSF Includes Award. So this is a mechanism by which we're trying to leverage the reach of professional societies to help steer the disciplines in directions that we want to be going with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a kind of a big deal. It's a 5-year project, $10 million grant that I'm in charge of the inclusive practices wing of this, which involves training faculty in holistic review and several other inclusive practices. Together with Julie, and also I'll point out that Kelly Rosinger, who's here in the Ed School, is part of this grant as well. We have created something called the California Consortium for Inclusive Doctoral Education, or CSIDE. Same basic thing, except instead of trying to come to the faculty through societies, we're going to the campuses and trying to make action teams at the graduate level to train each other, leveraging the power of peer-to-peer professional development. So maybe we don't need to talk about this, but why would you be concerned with diversity in graduate education to begin with? Well, there's three basic ideas here. There's moral and social good, the educational benefits that this brings to your institution, and then there's the plain old business case. And each of these items that follow here are examples of those three kinds of ways to think about why one might be interested in diversity. I am going to focus today mostly on representation and making the case that representation at the graduate level is important, and having that match our society, the US population, for example, is a good goal to have, and we're not there. Here's an example. So this is data from IPEDS showing the percentage of PhDs awarded to underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities. 25% is the maximum. That's in education. But these groups together constitute about a third of the US population. So the distance between that red line and one of those bars is a representation gap. So we're not doing very well, especially over on the right-hand side in natural sciences and engineering. So that was with respect to racial identity, and this is some gender data for STEM degrees awarded to women. In blue, you have bachelor's degrees, and in gray are PhDs. So one of the goals of one of the short-term goals of our projects is to try to make the blue bar and the gray bar have the same height. If they had the same height, then the fraction of individuals graduating with bachelor's degrees in these areas would match the fraction of the individuals getting PhDs in those areas. The numbers you see there are the actual numbers of humans it would take in order to do that. Right? So for example, in physics, we would need 218 more women annually across the country to get PhDs in order to make the blue bar match the gray bar. That's not a lot. If I plot the same thing, which I haven't done just for brevity, for underrepresented students, a lot of those numbers are in single digits. And that was one of the main reasons that the APS started working on this project, to try to make the bar for bachelor's degrees and the bar for PhDs in physics of equal magnitude. Turns out that takes only 30 PhDs across the country annually, extra. So the bridge program that was developed by the APS that I ran at South Florida is designed to do that. It's a project that accepts only students that have been rejected by every graduate program they applied to. We put them through, depending on the campus where this is located, the students will do 1 year or maybe a master's degree, basically showing that they can do graduate level work and research, getting them some research experience where they may not have had it in the past. The program has been extremely successful. The retention rate of the students that have been going through this now across a handful of campuses for 7 years roughly is about 90%, which is significantly higher than physics as a discipline. So consistently, the National Academies has had these issues on their radar. And so I don't know if you've read these kinds of reports in the past, but they will, at the end, they'll whittle everything down to 1 or 2 points, or maybe 3. So the one in the middle there, the expanding underrepresented minority participation, calls out explicitly the transition to graduate education as a critical factor for the enterprise of the United States for us to address. And that is consistent throughout, whatever that is, 13 years. So holistic review offers a way for us to address these issues and other things that we haven't even talked about. And holistic review, I'll give you briefly, our conception of this is a process that is comprehensive, systematic, and contextualized. Before I go more into that, what I'm going to talk about is what is not holistic review. And basically, this is the traditional process. So my colleague, Julie Passelt, has done a significant amount of work in the graduate education space with respect to equity and inclusion, including both admissions and retention. and some recruitment. So her work documented for the first time basically what we all know about admissions. Almost everywhere it's a two-tier process. By the way, if you haven't read this book, it's pretty good. The first tier are filters. The filters are typically based on undergraduate GPA, prestige or perceived prestige of the undergraduate institution, and GRE scores. That's how programs make the first cut. Sound familiar? Okay. Then tier 2 is where there's more subjectivity and qualitative assessment of the applicants. So this is where we talk about leadership and research, potential creativity, enthusiasm and passion for research, and if diversity is in the conversation, it's here. Okay. The problem with this is that it doesn't actually work very well. So these are data from the Council of Graduate Schools PhD completion project, showing across all of these different types of on the x-axis here. Can you all see my pointer? Not really very well, right? So across all the different disciplines, 50% is right here. And we put a lot of time into admissions for the net result to be 50%-ish, right? And I'm not going to talk too much about the anomalies. For instance, in math and statistics for African Americans, extremely low completion rates. Different groups in humanities. There are lots of reasons for this. Admissions is only one. One of the things that we're finding through the Bridge program and other related efforts is that quality of mentoring once the students arrive on campus is critical. And as faculty, y'all are scary. So peer mentoring is a tactic that we've employed to try to help the students when they first arrive on campus to integrate socially into the PhD program. What do I do with this green form? That's not a question students are going to go to a random faculty member and ask, right? And if they don't ask that question, maybe they didn't fill out the green form right. And then you got a problem. That's a silly example, but drinking beer on Friday nights also is a good example, right? So this process, not a whole lot better than a coin toss. And it perpetuates inequity in access. So the way that this occurs is through over-reliance on things like cumulative GPA, familiarity with schools or prestige, and test scores without considering context and the error bar. So cumulative GPA masks markers of success within transcripts. So as a recipient of many transcripts from students who were rejected from every PhD program they applied to, I was able to analyze these and find patterns that you may have seen if you've looked actually at transcripts. Some programs only look at cumulative GPA. A lot of underrepresented students come from high schools that weren't the best. First semester, maybe second semester, they're playing catch up. Grades are not great that first year, but a quarter of your GPA, cumulative GPA, is the first year. So your GPA is sunk, right? We see this perpetually throughout, not perpetually, we see this a lot. Those same students who might get a C in Calc 1 end up taking Calc 1 again. They don't get an A, but by the time they get to Calc 3, they're actually doing A-level work. If you just look at cumulative GPA, you don't see that progression. So that's one of the issues. So make sure that you look in there and try to see what's going on with transcripts. Grade inflation is another issue that undermines opportunities for underrepresented students to participate. And I say that based on a couple of factors. So here's grade inflation as a function of time. So if you just look at the most recent data, which is 2013, on the left are public schools, and on the right are private schools. The difference in GPA is a third of a letter grade. That is a lot when you're applying to graduate school. Part of the reason that this is important for underrepresented students is that most underrepresented students attend state colleges. So this is a ranked list of the programs that produce the most underrepresented students. On the left is engineering, on the right is physical sciences. So for example, University of Florida produces 240 engineering students annually that are underrepresented. That's the top rank. All the ones that are in black are state universities, and the ones that are in blue are private colleges. So most of the students are coming to you from state colleges where the GPAs, based on the grade inflation patterns, are going to be a little bit lower, just by virtue of where they went to school. And then there's frequent misuse of GRE scores. So ETS produces a document called the Guide to the Use of Scores. As I've gone around the country, I can't tell you how many times I've given this talk, but it's a lot. Most places that I go, the faculty don't use this, they don't follow it, and a lot of people have just never even heard of it. There's a lot of information in there about what you should and should not do with GRE scores. There are also significant race and gender discrepancies on the scores that are not familiar to most faculty. And then the correlations with success are questionable. ETS claims that correlations are to first-year grades. That's all they claim. If there was more to it, they would claim it. So here's some data or a quote from the Guide to the Use of Scores. It's an inexact measure. Only score differences that exceed the standard error of measurement of a given score can serve as a reliable indication of real differences. And so what that means is there's an error bar associated with the score that you receive, and it's not small. So my brain still thinks in the old scale, 70 to 40, 200 to 800. And that's a 60 point, the error is 60 points. So a 740 is the same as an 800, and there are lots of conversations where we're deciding between people by just a couple of, 10 or 20 points on the GRE in the old days. Now it's 3 points. So we have to remember that this is an intrinsically, there's intrinsic error in this tool. Further down in this document, they talk about cutoff scores, minimum acceptable scores. Don't use this. This is written down. GRE should not be used in isolation. Should not be used as sole criterion for admission, or for denial of admission. And then if you look here, why should you not use a GRE score, a GRE cutoff score? I'm going to highlight number 2. It says the proposed cutoff scores impact on the institution's goals related to diversity. So that is referring to these data here. So this is from a document called Vectors That Can Influence Performance on the GRE General Test, 2006-2007. This is the most recent data that they've bound in this way. What you're looking at are GRE quantitative scores for students, US citizens, who have self-identified as wanting to go to graduate school in the physical sciences. The bars here are summaries of score distributions. So the tick is the median. There's a bell-shaped curve or log normal distribution coming out of the board at you. And the categories here are race and gender. This is Asian, American, white, other Hispanic, Mexican American, Native American, African American, Puerto Rican, men, women. It was a recent study done by the American Physical Society to understand how cutoff scores are used in physics. And what they concluded is about a third of the PhD programs in physics use a cutoff score. Many of them just put it on their webpage. Others say that they're not using a cutoff score, but then turn around to say that the score has to be above something, right? So it turns out that the typical score is that. So no one under that red line can get into about a third of the physics PhD programs in the country, more or less by policy. So this gives us a little bit of a disadvantage at the diversity problem. when physics, when policies are implementing minimum scores. So these test discrepancies are technically not biased. So the psychometricians that make the test do a judicious job in making sure that there's no single question that adversely impacts one group. If they find such a question, they get rid of it. And then by induction, they say that the test is not biased. Yet these patterns permeate. They're independent of intended graduate major, qualitatively unchanged when you control for the undergraduate GPA of the student. The same for the subject tests, SAT math tests, 8th grade math tests, 4th grade math tests. So these patterns that you see that are coming to your graduate admissions committees are features of standardized testing. And I'm going to show you those data. So this is the same plot that I just showed, but it's slightly less pretty, and it's a little bit hard to see, but this is up here, all I'm going to do is toggle the intended graduate major, okay? So that's physical sciences, engineering, life sciences, business, social sciences, humanities and arts, education. These are students whose undergraduate GPAs were A. Mean SAT math scores, 8th grade math tests, 4th grade math tests. Percent of these groups not living in poverty. When you ask ETS what is the source of these score discrepancies, their claim is educational access at an early age, which probably should not tell you who's going to be the next best physicist or engineer or doctor. So despite these race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status issues, cutoff scores are used all the time by admissions committees. Why? Well, faculty aren't trained in selection. It's actually a subfield of psychology, right? And we don't even give them selection 101. It's very convenient to sort a spreadsheet. It's literally one button. Faculty are busy. Often they're reluctantly serving on admissions, not the library committee, right? It's a hard one. Very intense, very intense committee. And then there's mindsets. So this is something that Julie's work found as she sat in on PhD admissions committees for 2 years and was a fly on the wall trying to figure out what was going on. And one of the things that she found were perceived associations with intelligence and belonging and mitigating risk by aiming for individuals that have high GRE scores. That's not what the test is intended to tell you, right? So the GRE scores, the correlations are also questionable with success. We know this because there have been many meta-analyses on the GRE, but none of them has conclusively shown one way or the other. So there's no signal coming out of the noise here on all these studies. And then there's been a recent flurry of disciplinary specific studies, mostly in STEM. So there's been quite a few in biology, some in marine science. And we just published one in Science Advances earlier this year, where we looked at the admissions criteria, the metrics that are submitted by the students, and correlated those with PhD completion and graduate grades. And we found that the GREs don't tell us much useful information, right? So we find some statistically significant correlations, but the practical significance is quite small. So if you run the full range, the full dynamic range of the data that you have, the difference in the error bars is like so. And I have that data. We can talk about it later if you want. This is a big study. 27 PhD programs across the country, across all ranks of NRC ranking for research activity. Here's a snapshot of some of the data that we collected here. So this is graduate GPA as a function of the 4 major inputs for physics programs: verbal GRE, quantitative GRE, subject GRE, and up in the upper left, undergraduate GPA. So in the square brackets are the correlation coefficients reported by ETS, and our correlation coefficients are next to those. So you see that we're reproducing effectively what they've got. And so when I asked ETS, what is this going to look like when I plot all these data? They said, well, it'll be a straight line. If one of my students brought me this data and told me that was a straight line, I would, yeah, you get it, right? Okay, so, but these are the kinds of parameters that we're using to select students almost blindly in some cases, right? So the typical process here is not much better than a coin toss, but it efficiently filters traditionally underrepresented students from the applicant pool. So what we argue is that holistic review is needed from the start of the process. When you start the qualitative analysis of the students after you've already filtered out all the women and minorities, you still have a diversity problem, right? So you gotta start from the beginning. You have to do this simultaneously, introduce the things that you're interested in from the beginning. So here's what I mean by these different, the triad here. So comprehensive, numerous and diverse criteria. An example of that is on the right. Academic preparation, alignment with your program, non-cognitive competencies, which I'll talk about in a little bit, research potential, and I'm going to emphasize potential and not necessarily already achieved factors. And then diversity contributions or considerations. So considering the whole person and some of their potential means integrating all of this information simultaneously. Why you want to do this: diverse perspectives improve scholarly work. You all have seen this kind of data, right? This is not really a question anymore, that diversity is important for improving outcomes, both in the workplace, in business, and in academics. Better problem solving. And then socio-emotional skills are necessary for outstanding professional performance, but we don't typically assess for those in a systematic way. Contextualized, put those metrics in context. Note the error bars, understand the societal patterns and why somebody might be coming to you with a slightly less attractive GRE score than you typically would like. By the way, most of you were selected by the process, the traditional process, right? So it's normal for you to continue on with, or want to continue on with the way that you were selected. But that might not be the best case for where you're, best thing to do for where you want to go with your programs. Then put achievements in context. Achievements don't necessarily signal aptitude, ability, or potential. What we've been finding is a lot of PhD program committees are substituting experience in an REU program as research potential. And that's just because a different committee selected an individual to come to the REU program doesn't mean that they actually have potential or that they did anything, right? So, and not all students even know about REU programs, right? So that's an issue. Understanding the distributions of opportunities relative to societal patterns. So this is something related to if you go to a small college, for example, HBCUs, many HSIs, tribal colleges, they're small. They don't have a lot of faculty. They don't have a lot of research money. So the opportunity for the students to do the level of research that you would expect of a student who's at Penn State is just not, that's, right? So you have to put that into context. So we like to think about distance traveled. What did they do with the opportunity that they had? And then putting in admissions in context. So how the students align with your program, your identity and your mission, and what your actual broader goals are. That's an important factor in the yield conversation. You were talking about earlier for it. How do you get the students to actually show up? Well, if they align well to your mission, and you both think that, that's a big factor. And you can make admissions help your where you want to go with your program by articulating all of that from the beginning, publicly and internally. So systematic. This is probably the biggest. Let me see. What do I want to say? This is probably the one that is easiest for most programs to pick up. Develop shared and predefined criteria. You might actually already have to do this for faculty searches. Because there's a legal issue involved. In graduate student selection, there's not necessarily a legal issue involved. But you have to do this. With your colleagues, figure out what you want out of students and stick to that. So you then develop structured protocols. I'll talk about that in a moment with respect to rubrics. So these enhance efficiency, but they also enhance consistency, making sure that each individual is measured on all the parameters that you talked about up above. You can build in checks that promote equity and mitigate implicit bias. You're never going to totally get rid of it, but you can put the checks in. So a really good example is if you have these kinds of initial filters, if you look at your applicant pool, the demographics of your applicant pool, and then who's on your short list or your medium short list, you might realize, oops, and that's okay, right? It's okay to realize that. It's like good, and then go back and figure out how to correct your actions beforehand. This is something that we found that's an article that is just coming online, where with the programs that were involved with the pilot to our NSF Includes iGen Award, 6 PhD programs in physics, we collected all of their admissions data, all their applicants, and how that pool progressed all the way through to matriculation. And these were programs that went through our workshops and to various levels of acceptance. And we can show that each stage there, you see the impact of the proportions of women and underrepresented students go down at each stage. That's something that you all should be aware of. That's common, but you can try to check it. And then you can thoughtfully select your gatekeepers. The people on the admissions committee are important. The DGS is important. Diverse groups bring different perspectives to the application review process. So I come from a liberal arts college. A lot of my faculty didn't. So the perspective I bring on those committees is, oh, well, you've never heard of Oberlin, but you went to school in Southern California. It makes sense you never heard of Oberlin. It's a good school, right? But they don't think about it as a good school because they've never heard of it. So that perspective is important. By the way, at least in physics, it's really important to consider these small colleges because the bachelor's degrees granted to physicists in physics bachelor's degrees, 40% of them are awarded from small colleges. That's a huge fraction of individuals that have the potential to go to graduate school, but the faculty have a bias against them intrinsically because they're not coming from an R1 or even an R2. And then being systematic can also mean aligning your admissions process with your recruitment and your yield efforts, which I've alluded to a little bit. So I won't talk about it too much more because I have some specifics here in a moment. So, how are we doing? Good. I don't have a clock up here. Do we have a clock? How are we doing? We're good. Okay. I don't know what that means, but. All right, so I'm going to transition and talk about non-cognitive competencies. So non-cognitive competencies are one of the factors that we put up on the 5 or so things that you might want to consider. These are social and emotional skills that we use to navigate life. Examples that you've heard of are grit, perseverance, initiative, conscientiousness, things like this. It turns out that these things are measurable. It's what psychologists do for a living. They've been studied for decades. They mostly are used in industry because if they select the wrong mid-level managers, they lose money. So the psychologists that I've spoken with have lots of tools like this that are proprietary because when you work with Exxon, they pay you a ton of money to keep your assessment out of the hands of Shell, right? Because they want the upper hand. So one of my collaborators is Joanne Quinn. She's at the med school at the University of South Florida. She runs the physician leadership program and she got her PhD at Case Western in organizational psychology and is an expert in emotional intelligence. Her PhD advisor was Richard Boyatzis, who was one of the people with Dan Goleman who created this concept of emotional intelligence. So an interesting thing is that I started learning about this through a MOOC. So I went on Coursera and I took a MOOC called Inspiring Leadership Through Emotional Intelligence. And I did that because I thought it was going to get me in trouble less at home. Turns out that was wrong. But what I learned there was, wow, there are all these things that psychologists know that we could use in the admissions process or the faculty selection process that we just don't. And there's a whole body of research out there. So these things predict academic and job performance by themselves without any other influence. They have little, if any, group differences by race or gender. So the research out there shows, unlike things like GRE, levels of conscientiousness, grit, perseverance, et cetera, do not vary by gender, race, or culture of origin. That was mind-blowing. Because if we now introduce those things that we all know are important for success into our admissions process explicitly, then we can help to level the playing field where for underrepresented individuals because the rest of the process is stacked against them effectively. These things also add to the information that we know about students. They're orthogonal to the cognitive measures, like GPA and GRE scores, all of which are relatively correlated for each individual, pretty highly correlated. So what are these things? So the emotional social competence inventory contains these items here. They're separated into 4 quadrants: self-management, self-awareness, relationship management, and social awareness. And if you just peruse those, you can imagine that many of those are valuable or would be valuable to students in PhD programs and different walks of graduate education. They might be very different based on your discipline, but there may be some universal ones. So the workshop that Julie and I give is a full day deal. We do a part 1 that's about 2 hours, a little bit more in depth than this, and then a follow-on, which is about 3 hours. And in that, we walk the faculty through this concept and how, figuring out what things they might like out of their students. So we've done this now with about 400 different faculty over the last couple of years, mostly STEM faculty, but not exclusively. And here's what they report. So this is the results from all of those. So in blue is crucially important. So self-management, about 2/3 roughly, a little bit less than 2/3 of the faculty believe that self-management cluster is crucially important for student success in research. Self-awareness is important. Social awareness and relationship management. I have to say that most of the people who took this were physicists. So you may find a completely different result for the bottom 2 graphs if you move colleges, right? But not always. So Here's some data. This is a research study that was conducted by Boyatzis in dentistry. So they correlated professional performance, looked for correlations between professional performance and admissions criteria, with admissions criteria and non-cognitive competencies. So what they found was that the cognitive measures, so they have a thing called a dental admissions test, the DAT. That tells you how good students are going to do, how well students are going to do in the classroom, so that's a didactic column. But it doesn't tell you if they're going to hurt you when you sit down in the dentist chair. Right? The non-cognitive aspects, they kind of have some correlation maybe with grades, but they definitely tell you whether or not the person is going to make for a good dentist. They were able to throw out 3 of those quadrants as being relevant to the success of the dental students. So only that upper left quadrant on self-management was relevant in their study. So those are these enumerated items here, which you can imagine would be, I want those out of all my students and all of my colleagues and myself. So the upshot of that work, and there's been follow-on work that has found similar results, is that cognitive ability and knowledge are threshold aspects of professional work. They're necessary but not sufficient for outstanding professional performance. So I'm going to move on to rubrics. Rubrics are the easiest thing for faculty to pick up. It's the most ubiquitous finding that we have, is that faculty know what rubrics are. It's not an unfamiliar concept. But a lot of faculty never occurred to them, hey, I could use this thing that I use to make sure I grade well consistently across all my papers. I can use that to also evaluate candidates. So it's easy, it's a low barrier for adoption for this kind of thing. So rubrics are a really good example of how you might employ holistic review. These are comprehensive, they're contextualized, and they're systematic. All right, so I'll give you a few examples here. So if we take alignment, for example, you've got these 5 major categories, but then you want to blow that up into a couple of sub-items. So in alignments, you might talk about research interests of the student, what the faculty actually need. And I didn't put geography here because I knew Ford was going to talk about it, but I put geography here because a lot of faculty think that, of course, every student's going to want to come to my program. And we know that that's not true. So we just gave a workshop 2 weeks ago at Cornell. They have the same problem, right? I don't know if you all have been to Ithaca, but I get it. I know the problem, right? So one of the biggest questions we asked, or biggest findings we found when asking the PhD program directors in physics, what can we do for you? It was help us reduce the uncertainty in who's actually going to show up, right? So if you use something like geography in your evaluation, it might help you, right? So here's an example how you might blow that up a little bit more. So I'm going to focus just on geography. So when you make a rubric, you want to use course levels, high, medium, and low. There's just not a whole lot more you can do than that, right? And if you have multiple items throughout your rubric, it's okay to just put people in one of those 3 buckets and then add across all of those buckets. They can be low on something, they'll make it up somewhere else. So here's an example of how you might operationalize geography. So there's a clear and sincere non-academic reason for the student to want to come to our location. And then on the low hand, on the low side, the importance of location is unclear. Most of the applications are going to be like that probably. So they're like that because you didn't ask the students to talk about it, right? Which is something I'll talk about in a moment. Here's a big one. So this is something that I put together for physics programs, but then I tweaked it to just be STEM. So the basic idea is you've got these 5 major categories, which I've indicated with different coloration. And then you've got high, medium, and low, and each cell is operationalized in some way. There's something that it can be specific, or it can be relatively vague. And it's okay for those things to matter, or for those things to occur in the same rubric. One of the things that you want to try to do, though, is operationalize each bucket in such a way that ideally a third of your candidates are going to fall into each bucket. It's going to be hard to do that. You're going to have to iterate in order to make that happen. But it's an ideal situation. So an example, the previous item where we talked about, is that up here still? It's not up here. The geography, instead of them leaving it up to the student to just have not told you anything, you can say, okay, we know that there are a lot of students who apply here that come from Pennsylvania, and they probably want to stay in the driving distance from home. So then, but they didn't talk about it explicitly, so maybe they don't care that much, so we'll put them in the low category. All right, that might be a way to do that. Geography, by the way, I was thinking about this when Ford was talking about the yield efforts. There's some work by Bersola et al. From UCLA where they looked across different disciplines and I think universities to try to understand how students made their matriculation decisions. And so this speaks to that yield process. How did you interact with the student, et cetera. Geography is an important thing that from the student perspective. So it doesn't necessarily always tell you where they're going to go, but it tells you where they're applying. So they're applying kind of regionally. But that doesn't necessarily tell you where they're going to end up. So some benefits to rubrics. They provide that structure, and by structure they also leads to equity. So you're assessing all the applicants on the same factors, whatever those factors may be. You don't have to have as many factors as I showed. You could have more. You could have less. And so the reason for this is that it helps to mitigate things like implicit bias, right? Your brain is doing a lot of stuff, right? And when you're in admissions, you're flipping through folders or whatever, how it's scrolling. I don't know how you do it. But it's a fast processing thing. And if you don't have the structure to make sure that you look at all the items that you have predefined as being worthy of looking at, then you might find one thing and then not look at everything else in as much detail as you wish, right? You can do that consciously, but you can also do it subconsciously, right? Your brain is working very hard. So take a look at this. I'll give you an example. So here's a full house up on the right. Tens over kings, and probably none of you realize that the 10 of diamonds should be red, because you know diamonds are red. And if you know diamonds are red, when you look at the picture, your brain doesn't even do the calculation to figure out what the color the diamond was. So if you have a rubric that says check the color, then you're going to check the color. All right. So some other benefits here, the specificity that can help mitigate bias by having the faculty focus on those predefined factors and not other things that emerge that they might think are relevant but are not what you all as a group declared to be critical or important to measure. Reliability. If you have a structure that's predefined and you all talk about it, then your raters will have similar ratings. It won't always be the same. You don't necessarily want that to be the case. But it allows for that to happen in a more systematic way than otherwise can happen. It's especially effective for you to, at the beginning of each season, or if you're developing a rubric, to go grab some old folders and everybody rate the same couple of folders, and then get together as a group and talk about why your scores were different. There may be very valid reasons why they're different. Hey, you don't know Oberlin, I know, liberal arts schools are okay, for example. You also, through the reliability here shows up in the tethering of different types of metrics. So what this means effectively is that not one thing can overwhelm the evaluation of a folder. GRE scores are a perfect example. You can fold GRE scores into that concept of academic preparation if you want to use them, even after I just showed you all that data. All right? But the point is to make it now one factor out of n, as opposed to a factor that has uncontrolled weight. So there's synergies here with recruitment and application. So application prompts are a really interesting thing. If you know you want the students to talk about something, ask them to do it, and then align it to your rubric, right? Personal statements, a lot of the prompts for personal statements across the country say, give us a personal statement. But your system here, I know, allows you to tailor what you ask the students. So you can be very specific. Review is expedited. The efficiency is increased when you use a rubric. So this is anecdotal evidence that we have, but it makes a lot of sense, especially if your raters are coming to similar results and you're only looking for certain things. You're not trying to read between the lines. And so that reduces faculty load. You can then use this to align your program's values and mission to the students you're selecting, making sure that you do that. And then there's the issue of accountability. Most lawsuits are at the undergraduate level. Most lawsuits that have something like a rubric are easier for you to defend. After we visited the University of Michigan and did this workshop for the applied physics program, they developed a rubric. They were subsequently sued by a white applicant who claimed bias in their program, and they were able to produce a rubric to legal affairs and said, this is how we selected our students, and it went away. Ad hoc review, where you don't have anything written down, is a little bit harder to defend. A little. So I have no idea how long I've been talking, so I'm going to wrap it up here and just give you some idea of like what we've been able to do with this across the country. So these are some programs that we visited. Ohio State Physics implemented a rubric that fixed the GRE score. They also had a really interesting thing happen there where the experimental physicists and the theoretical physicists disagreed on how the GRE should be used. So they said, okay. And then they made a rubric that is the same, and then it bifurcates for that issue, and then comes back together. Totally fine. After they did that, 40% of their cohort ended up being underrepresented individuals. MIT Chemical Engineering added into their evaluation something about potential as opposed to preparation specifically, which allowed them to increase the number of underrepresented students to 5 a year from typically 1 a year. Santa Barbara eliminated the GRE requirement for the university level fellowship. Interesting thing at our astrophysics program, they transferred this concept to their REU selection and have a quite diverse pool there. University of Chicago was like is anybody from Chicago? Oh man, I'm gonna stay over here. Oh. I didn't have a good time in Chicago. It turned out to be okay in the end, but it took 3 years. And it took a champion in the program and the department chair to be on board. And they implemented a baby rubric. It was a very big step for them, a very big step. And the number of women they admitted in the program went from zero-ish a year to a third of their cohort. It was cool. It was cool to see that, especially after I wanted to quit my job after I left. So there's a bunch of other stuff on here that you can read until I click it. All right, so putting holistic review in context. This is just one piece, one cog in the wheel, right? It's not a silver bullet. You can do it wrong. You can make your rubric reproduce exactly what you're doing now. I'm sorry, I don't mean to say you're doing something wrong now. But you can use a rubric to reproduce the traditional process. There you go. And the inequities therein. So it's useful for identifying talent from many underrepresented groups, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. So here's a typical cycle that programs can find themselves in. There are a few underrepresented students enrolled in their program, so they admit some. They come to campus and they realize there's no critical mass, there's maybe a climate issue, and then they enroll somewhere else. And then the cycle just repeats. In the worst case, you might be able to, and this is an article that Julie has just published that's called Bait and Switch. You can get the students to matriculate, and then you may have the shiniest web page and the most well-intended admissions committee, but if the rest of the faculty aren't on board or the process isn't on board and the department, it makes the climate miserable for those students, then the next year, when applicants visit, the students tell them, right? This is like your worst nightmare. So you have to integrate all of these efforts. You can't just make a shiny web page and change the way you admit students. So Scott asked me to maybe put together a few things for y'all to consider what you might do. So first thing, engage your faculty in introspection. What do you want out of students? Who are your best students? What qualities characterize those students? Who are your worst students? What qualities, make them not so successful? And then how do you select for the first group, not the second group? Decide what you really want the applicants to tell you, and then ask for it explicitly. Right? There's a lot of personal statements in physics that start off with, when I was 8, my grandfather took me out to the cornfield, and I looked up at the stars, and I knew I was going to be a physicist. And I know that there are exactly 0 people on admissions committees who cared about that question, or that statement, right? There's not a lot of real estate there. So if you can give some guidance to the students to tell them what it is that you want and what you're going to evaluate them on, they will do that, right? One program asked me, it's actually been asked several times, if we were to do something like that, our application would be different. And so we wouldn't get the carpet-bombed letter and personal statement. And I said, well, okay. How many applications do you get now? 800. So if you whittle out 200 or 300 of those applicants because they don't want to put in the effort to answer the questions you want them to be evaluated on, maybe that's an indication they didn't want to actually go to your program in the first place. Okay, and then the last thing, experiment with a rubric. Doesn't have to be as big as the one I showed. It can be simple. But it provides some structure that may not exist at the moment. That's all I have for the moment, so thank you very much. So, any questions, comments, tomatoes? Actually, there were apples out there. I prefer you don't throw the apples. Yeah. Do we want to do the mic? Hi.
I'm Carol, and actually I'm from communication sciences and disorders, so this is sort of like health professions / behavioral science kind of area, so a little different. But I wanted to kind of follow what you're saying about when you have like 800 applications, 200 less wouldn't be a big deal, and that's absolutely true. But I'm thinking not only about PhD applications, but also in our department we have master's degrees, and there we do PhD, very manageable, not an issue, number of applications to review, but for masters, we're talking around 200 a year. So I want to be fair to all of those applicants, but it doesn't seem possible to do the whole rubric. The filtering comes in because it doesn't seem possible to give the full rubric review to 200 odd applications. Do you have any suggestions about how to kind of start narrowing that down while avoiding some of the pitfalls of that filtering process?
Sure. So depends what you're doing with those. Often that filtering stuff those are metrics typically, right? University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill has as a faculty in the physics department, they've come up with something that it's an algorithm that takes all those data. How many faculty do you need to look at the GPA, right? It takes all those data. They agreed on a way to analyze transcripts generally and other elements. And they integrated that into just an algorithm. And what that does, that's something that a staff person can do so that the faculty then can put their effort into the more qualitative assessment of personal statements and letters of recommendation. So that's one way.
You're still using metrics, but you're setting a threshold.
You don't even, I don't think they even set a threshold. They just like do that calculation offline. And then when they analyze the other materials, they turn those into metrics also in these sorts of buckets. And then you've got a bucket for metrics, a bucket for letters, a bucket for personal statements, for example. So, and if you agree upon the way that you're going to analyze the letters or the personal statement using a rubric type thing, it actually goes faster than you imagine, because you're looking for specific things that are predefined, and they're either there and they can go into high, or they're not there and they can go to low, or they're somewhere in between. So the actual review time, that same program found that when they used the rubric, the efficiency of review was much faster than normal. But giving attention to all of the program or all of the applicants is important. One of the sound bites from the Chicago thing was after they started using the rubric, our external evaluator has one person who was difficult during the workshop, said, "You know, I really like this rubric thing. Now I read the whole application." Right? So you don't have to have 20 items. You can have 4 or 5. So it's not, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it is, it's not as bad as you think that it might be. Do you want to?
Hi, I'm Marty. I'm in Human Development and Family Studies. I've been on admissions committees for 7 of my 10 years here. And one question I have is about a process that is related to admissions, which has to do with how we think about candidates for university fellowships. Mm-hmm. And I will just share with you how we operate, and this maybe you can correct this. This is solely determined on GREs. And that is how we operate in our admissions committee when we consider who might be viable for that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a conversation we can have. Maybe I'm laboring under a misconception, but if not, or if GREs are weighed very, very heavily, what guidance can you give the admissions committee in terms of how to engage in the process we need to engage in, but also get funding for our students?
Yeah, I can't help you with that. So that's a discussion you have to have with your faculty on whoever's in control of that thing. So I showed Santa Barbara. So after we came and we did a workshop like this, it was one of the longer ones. They actually voted as a faculty to get rid of the GRE as part of their presidential fellowship. And it made sense to them. They'd been talking about it for a while. But having now the data that show that this is, the discrepancies by group, but also within disciplines. So do all the disciplines have GREs or use them? on campus that are eligible for those fellowships, right? So there was some inequity raised there because I don't remember which discipline it was, but it was on the not science side of campus, didn't even require the GREs. So their students were automatically ineligible for that presidential level fellowship.
But it would be possible to use a similar type of process in making decisions for university fellowships.
Oh, sure.
As well. Okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So the example where the RIT group used the rubric for selecting undergraduate research experience folks, RU individuals, this process is general to selection, right? You can use this, a lot of this is what we use also, as I mentioned previously, in faculty selection, right? You predefine these things and bin them. Yeah. What, you've got the mic. Is there another mic?
Yeah, okay.
Let me see if this mic works. Hold on.
Yeah, we don't want to bias for this side of the room. That's not
Yeah,
right.
I'm gonna stand over here.
Mort, I'm in energy and mineral engineering. So as a relatively new director of graduate studies for a graduate program who wants generally to experiment with some of these things and try some of this, how do we go the next step? We can follow up with our deans who invited you and hosted you, but how to operationalize, where can we get examples? Because I understand you're sort of Exxon versus Shell, but I'm hoping some of the departments you worked with will share, here's some of the questions we asked. Here's how we measure these emotional intelligence things. So for those of us who are not psychologists,
Yeah.
we would welcome some more specific examples and guidance. Where can we go for that?
Sure. So there's an exceptional program called the Fisk Vanderbilt Master's PhD program. They have spearheaded a lot of the concepts behind bridge programs. They have an article published in the American Journal of Physics, and if you read that, they have in the appendix to that has just their whole protocol, which was developed not by them. They realized that they're scientists and might screw it up, so they got a social scientist involved to help them do the selection. So there they talk about evaluate. So interviews are, and you all talked about interviews last time, but that can be bad news interviews. So they have a structured interview protocol there, a rater sheet. They have questions that they ask. You can turn some of those questions into prompts for your application, and so on. So I haven't mentioned this yet, but my colleague Joe Quinn, who is the emotional intelligence expert in South Florida, we're developing an assessment of non-cognitive competencies based on what faculty say they want out of the students. And so that's something we're hoping that can be used on the front end, but that's a decade away probably. So.
That was Vanderbilt, what?
Fisk Vanderbilt. There was a question back here, right?
It was the same question.
Same question, okay. You jumped, did you want? No, okay. Sorry, you're too close.
Yeah, so Mort actually asked a question I was going to ask. Articulated it better than I could, actually. But I have a second question, which is the data are pretty compelling about the shortcomings of the GRE from a statistical standpoint. Is there any evidence that it's also that there are economic barriers to it? I'm hearing from some of our applicants that the costs now of taking the test and sending it where you want to have it sent are now north of $300, which is becoming non-trivial for a lot of our applicants.
Right. What's your area?
Meteorology.
Meteorology. Okay. So yeah, this is a big deal. So this person by the name of Meg Urey, who was the department chair at Yale in physics and the president of the American Astronomical Society, she wrote an article or a letter to chairs outlining all of these issues. There's the cost issue to the students, and most students are now applying to upwards of 10 places. And each of those has an application fee of about $100. So you're $1,000 in already without the test scores. So there are big economic issues, and different places are using that as a rationale for why they want to get rid of the GRE. Another thing is the GRE is not actually available everywhere to just even take it. So you're limiting yourself globally, and in some cases regionally. So if I don't have the data's in my computer, but I don't have it off the top of my head. But there are some big metropolitan areas where the GRE is offered only in the fall or only in the spring or something like that, and it makes it very difficult for the applicants to take the test locally and get their applications in on the deadlines that programs are saying. Internationally, we have students drive to different countries to take the GRE. That's a pretty big barrier, right? And it's mostly only in the US. Right? I think India has 4 testing sites.
Hi, good
Hello.
morning. I have a quick question. Joyce Hobson, King College of Health and Human Development, the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. You talked today, you presented what we really have been talking a lot about, which is attempting to create a fair, more equitable system for both identifying students, recruiting, the entire process. I'm curious about outcomes thus far. That's going to be part of the conversation as I think everyone considers how to do this work better and have the kinds of outcomes we want. But I'm already hearing, well, does it work? Are the students who are differently considered and admitted, are they graduating? Do they get through the programs? And I'm wondering about some of that. What you know about that. I know this is still early in the process.
Yep.
Thank you.
So the answer is yes. And in the case of the APS Bridge program and the Fisk Vanderbilt program, a lot of the Bridge like programs that I'm familiar with, the retention rates are significantly higher than what you find in the discipline at large. So the Bridge program in physics, the students are at the 90% rate. Same thing with the Fisk Vanderbilt students. Whereas overall in physics, the retention rate is just shy of 60%, I think. That said, admissions is only one part of it. So when you admit the students, places that engage in holistic review willingly are often also doing other things to promote equity and inclusion in their programs. So there's not really an experiment that can be done because of all the moving parts, right? But what we know so far is that the places that use these kinds of evaluations are not worse off and often better. And so that comes from the stuff that I've just mentioned. And then there are also some, I forgot what your area was. I'm sorry, could you repeat your area?
Oh, I'm Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. So
Okay.
at Penn State, all of our academic colleges have multicultural affairs,
Yep.
diversity offices that
Got it.
are thinking about this work all the time.
So I have a couple of, so they've been doing holistic review in health sciences and the med areas for a long time. And so the outcomes there are showing that programs that institute many aspects of holistic review see improvements in diversity. And in the worst case, they don't see lower quality of students or anything like that. That depends, but again, depending on how your program is positioned, if it's not actually able to select or to accommodate students that have different preparation, then that's an important thing to understand. And it's okay to have a bar that says you must have taken electromagnetism 2 out of this textbook. And if you haven't, then sorry, you're just not going to be successful here. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is with these bridge type concepts where maybe somebody didn't have that electromagnetism too, but your graduate school is flexible enough to allow them to take it at the undergraduate level here without it being such a big deal. Right. Go ahead, you already have the mic.
Hello, I'm Jessica Hoffman from the graduate school. So I heard you talk about letter reading and interviewing, and I wondered if you could speak more on those topics, because I think for areas that might transition from a traditional approach to a rubric approach, it might be hard to, especially for us, we mostly do funding evaluation, break out of the buckets of the traditional thought process. So you can read a letter in a way that just gives you a traditional review. You can read it, or you can evaluate what faculty wrote about the interview in a way that gives you a traditional view.
So you can have a rubric for reviewing letters. It doesn't have to be one big thing. You can have like a micro rubric for that kind of thing. But you can also, again, as I mentioned with the students, you can tell the faculty what you want them to talk about. Are you talking about internal faculty? Like somebody who's proposing a student for funding? Or are you talking about external letters?
Typically, we're looking at external letters from the admissions packet that's passed along as a part of our funding model.
Okay. Yeah. So so if it were internal people, then you've got some screws that you could turn. But with the external people, it's not quite as easy. Yeah, so I would go through the process of trying to figure out what it is you want to see out of those letters, and again, if it's there or it's not, trying to give it a gradation that's coarse, high, medium, and low, to try to just bring some systematics to the process. If you can't get the letter writers to talk about the things that you're specifically interested in. We have time for one more question.
Hi, Tanya Peoples, College of Engineering, Chemical Engineering, and Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion. And my question is about sort of the culture around, some of the things you put in the emotional intelligence. And it's interesting how if you were to map out what faculty say are important, it's the self-management. But I also wonder if there's a culture in our programs that's off-putting to underrepresented folks that they don't want to have to manage themselves. They want to be in community and work with a mentor and that. And how much do you think, is there a public-facing part of those rubrics? If you're this kind of person, this is the program for you.
Well, I think talking about or promoting what it is you're interested in to potential applicants is important. So I don't think you should reveal the whole rubric, but those big categories, we're looking for these sorts of things. I think that's important. The first part of your question about, yes, about maybe those things aren't exactly what we want, or what underrepresented students want to have to exhibit. I get that. And all of us, the people who took that survey, were selected by a process that values those things, right? And so when I can break that out a little bit more, for example, empathy is like one of the most hated topics, right? Or most lowly rated things. But if you want to produce teachers, faculty, might want some of that, right? So that was a snapshot. It's not necessarily an aspiration. So you can try to integrate those different factors in, but that doesn't mean that you're going to put the students into an environment that accepts those. So culture change is hard, right? So I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, but it's a tricky one. But you can put in place professional development for the faculty, cultural humility training, et cetera. That might be ways in which you can make the culture in the department. It probably won't shift, but it might sway.